The conflict in Ukraine rages on, and the Chinese and US presidents discuss the crisis in a video link call. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The conflict in Ukraine continues. The crisis has caused the displacement of more than 6 million Ukrainians, according to the United Nations. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden have talked about the crisis during a conversation on Friday. We begin with this report by CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King.
Well, important video call in a time of crisis, about 1 hour, 50 minutes by accounts between the leaders of the two biggest economies. Of course, there is so much in this bilateral relationship, but Ukraine, of course, dominating very much the discussions. Remember, the White House here has pointed the finger at Moscow and Beijing, saying Moscow's approached China for support militarily. Both capitals denied it. The evidence that they produced was a request for military ready meals, meals ready to eat, not necessarily a game changer when it comes to war between Russia and Ukraine. But anyway, there was also a threat of severe consequences if China did not pull back in its relationship with Russia, even though other countries are continuing their trading relationship with Russia. For example, India buying, 3 million barrels of oil announced in the last 24 hours. This call, though, very much between the two leaders. And let me just read you what President Xi talked about in their joint responsibilities for peace. As permanent members of the UN Security Council and the world's two leading economies, China and the US must not only guide their relations forward along the right track, but also shoulder their share of international responsibilities and work for peace and tranquility. Now, as you know, Beijing has hit back with a pointed finger of Washington and basically said, look, you don't seem to be much involved in these peace processes between Russia and Ukraine, which may be getting somewhere. You've seen the shift in the various positions, especially on joining NATO. And in fact, that's the second bit of China saying, look, this didn't happen in a vacuum. NATO's eastward expansion since the end of the Cold War has been criticized from every Russian president, from Yeltsin to Putin, and by a lot of Western policymakers who know a lot about Russia. Now, on the other side of the relationship, I think it was a bit more productive in terms of China wanting to get the reassurances that it always needs from Washington, especially over Taiwan. Biden saying that he would not recognize any more moves towards independence from Taipei. That is something Beijing regularly needs to hear because of the growing contacts that we have seen between Taipei and Washington. Also, the American leadership stressing that it does not seek to change the government in Beijing either, something that goes without saying, but we've seen the pressure campaigns along its periphery. So that is good news. No news yet on tariffs. You know, the Biden administration kept the Trump tariffs of over $350 billion worth of Chinese imports here. There was hints they would lower them. You would think in a time of rampant inflation at the producer and consumer level they might do so, and it might be a good way of warming relations between Beijing and Washington in a time of crisis. Well, we'll see. Nathan King, CGTN, outside the White House.
Okay, let's bring in our panel to discuss the latest developments. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Ga. He is chair professor at Soochow University. With us here in Washington, D.C. is Michael O'Hanlon. He is senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. And also joining the discussion is Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian expert and a professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you. Victor Ga, there's been much commentary here in the United States on China's view of the Ukraine crisis, as well as China's relationship with Russia. What is your assessment of the telephone call between President Xi and President Biden on Friday?
Thank you very much for having me. The President Biden of the United States and Chinese President Xi Jinping did have a very important and historically significant phone call last night. This means that even at the worst time in international situation, the Chinese leader, the American leader should and could communicate with each other directly. Now, they each presented their view about what's going on in Ukraine. Apparently, their lines were not aligned together, and China is really standing very firm on its own principles. And from the very beginning of the military conflict in Ukraine, China has been consistent. China has been calling for de-escalation, saving as many civilian lives as possible, and engaging in diplomacy and dialogue to seek a sustainable, long-lasting solution to this Ukrainian situation. China also believes that there are many strands involved in the Ukrainian crisis, and each of these strands need to be analyzed on the merits of its own, rather than rushing to conclusion one way or the other. At present, what's the most important thing, as far as China is concerned, is to stop pouring more fuel onto the fire, and to provide maximum humanitarian assistance.
Victor, the headline in today's New York Times is that Biden warned China of quote-unquote consequences if it aids Russia in this war. What do you make of the language that's being used there? Would that be seen by China as being somewhat bellicose?
Well, first of all, I would say for the United States, the only right thing to do is to deal with China as an equal and show China sufficient respect. If you want to deal with China from an attitude of so-called strength, for example, or try to lecture China and impose your will or your version of the truth onto China, it will not work. It may even backfire. China-Russian relations have been normalized since 1989, and for the last 33 years, it has been very mutually beneficial. Chinese people and Russian people deal with each other with respect, on equality, with mutual benefit. Now, their bilateral trade was in the range of about $200 billion last year. It's all encompassing, it's all inclusive, so no country in the world should expect that they can bring the China-Russian bilateral trade to a halt, or they can throw a big wedge in China-Russian relations. So I think the United States need to be aware of what it is up to on the one hand, and also try to create conditions for the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. The first thing importantly right now is to cease pouring more fuel onto the fire in Ukraine and offer maximum humanitarian assistance.
Okay. Michael O'Hanlon, President Biden apparently asked for this telephone call, and there is reporting here in the United States that Washington is concerned that Russia might turn to China for support in its war against Ukraine. So put this in context for us. What prompted the call, and what is the United States hoping to get from China?
Greetings. Well, I think you're right in the way you summarized it. I also thought the report at the beginning of the show was excellent in describing what we know of the phone call. You know, I think that China does have a potentially very useful role as a mediator of sorts between Russia and Ukraine. And I think the United States needs to recognize that fact. So I'm a little bit more critical of China's role here than your other guests tonight, but I agree with them that there is a real value in having China in this position where it could, in fact, help look for a compromise and take advantage of the fact that it's been so supportive over the years of Vladimir Putin, even though Beijing and President Xi obviously don't welcome this conflict, to therefore use their position to try to find some kind of middle ground. I think there is a middle ground personally. And the middle ground is that we all agree to help secure Ukraine's sovereignty without NATO membership. And then we try to get Russian forces as part of this deal off Ukrainian territory. That's the basic trade space. And then, of course, sanctions would generally be lifted, and we could try to go back to rebuilding that part of Europe. I think China may be in a position to try to facilitate that kind of a negotiation. So rather than worry too much about beating up on China, I would rather take advantage of the position that China now finds itself in. I think China should recognize that Russia invaded Ukraine. There is clarity about that. We should use that word. We shouldn't avoid that word or pretend otherwise, but there is a real advantage in China's position if we can now collectively work together to try to get some kind of a ceasefire and a settlement.
Right, Michael, if we look at what President Biden is trying to get from China, I mean, how does one reconcile a request like that if we look at the recent history of the relationship between these two countries, the United States has taken several hostile actions against China, mainly in trade. It's even banned some Chinese companies from working in the United States and persuaded other countries not to allow these companies to work there either. And we just heard over the past few days that the United States is planning on setting up an anti-China missile network in what's known as the First Island chain, which includes Taiwan, Okinawa, and some parts of the Philippines as well. How does one see the two of these things?
Well, first of all, philosophically speaking, countries can have their differences on one issue, but recognize that there is a major crisis somewhere else where they have a mutual interest in trying to tamp down that conflict. I think China and the United States both believe in trying to promote the well-being of their own citizens and of the world economy more generally. And I, as an American, salute China for all it has contributed to improving the well-being of its own people, as well as the well-being of many people around the world.
Right.
But that fact does not change that we're going to still have some disagreements between Beijing and Washington on trade policy, on economic policy. I don't really think you want me to rehash them now, except to say there are places where I think China's been wrong and been exploitative on the economic relationship, but that doesn't change the fact that both sides have an interest in ending this war. We can keep debating, and we should keep debating and trying to resolve our economic differences, but that's in a different category from a hot war in Ukraine, where I think we can work together, recognizing we have a common interest.
Okay. Anton Fedyashin, there have been talks taking place between Ukraine and Russia. So far, they've yielded no positive results. There's been no breakthroughs at all. How do you view the Xi-Putin call? Is there a role for China here in trying to get this conflict to come to an end?
Yes, definitely. And part of it would be to nudge the Ukrainians to compromise further. This is going to be very difficult to do because what the Russians are requiring, besides neutrality, which I think is already a de facto reality that no one, even President Zelensky, denies. But the Russians are also asking for the recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, and also, of course, the recognition of the sovereignty of the two republics in the southeast, Donetsk and Luhansk. This is going to be exceptionally difficult for the Ukrainians to agree to. Look, it is impossible to predict right now how this is going to play out. But I think that when Vladimir Putin looks to the South, both geographically and to the global South more broadly, he understands that the very strong and completely understandable reaction to the invasion from the West does not include countries that, in some, actually contain the largest part of the global population. The agreement to disagree that the Biden-Xi talk seemed to produce today on the issue of Ukraine specifically is really part of a chain of events, which includes the fact that the United States could not prevail on the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to increase oil production, that India, as Nathan correctly mentioned in the opening report, is purchasing Russian oil. I think Moscow is weighing its options and also trying to maximize its gains in Ukraine. I think China has a unique possibility to play a moderator that both Kiev and Moscow will accept.
Victor Gao, China has a good relationship with both countries, with both Russia and Ukraine. So how much is at stake for China if this conflict continues?
You are absolutely right. China has good relations, strategic in nature and substantive in nature with Russia on the one hand. China is also the largest investor in Ukraine and has very good friendly relations with Ukraine for many years. Therefore, this military conflict or war in Ukraine really hurts China's economic and trade relations. Now, on the other hand, for China to possess good relations and channels of communication with Russia on the one hand and with Ukraine on the other hand is becoming a very rare and indispensable asset in the unfolding situation in Ukraine for China to offer and to play eventually a good mediation role. Now, China cannot dictate any terms of the settlement eventually, but China can play a good office mediation role so that the parties directly and indirectly involved can be brought together and achieve a lasting peace eventually.
All right, Michael O'Hanlon, I've just got a minute left in this segment of the show. The United States is pouring weapons into Ukraine at the moment. And on the surface, really, we don't see much of an effort by the United States to get this resolved diplomatically. I mean, shouldn't there be much more of an effort from Washington to get this settled at the negotiating table?
That may be right. You know, I agree with you. I don't know what's going on. I don't see a lot of action. The diplomatic activity seems to be between the Ukrainians and the Russians, even as President Zelensky has to just try to stay alive as his main job most of the day. And so I do think that between China and the United States, and perhaps others, it's time for us to push harder, to think through some of these specifics and to try to push them pretty hard. And so I would welcome that. The United States, as you know, has favored bringing Ukraine into NATO. I've been against that idea for a long time because I thought it would produce a bad reaction in Russia. I don't think NATO is an aggressive alliance, but I don't expect the Russians to see it the same way I do. So maybe it's time to make a virtue of necessity and start looking for a new security architecture for Eastern Europe that would not bring Ukraine into NATO. That can be the basis for the negotiation.
Okay, Anton Fedyashin, very briefly, we are seeing some movement towards settling this, as you pointed out earlier on. You know, there is now an acceptance, it seems, on the part of Ukraine that it will not be a part of NATO, that it will have to declare itself a neutral country. So, what does that augur for us? I mean, what does that tell us?
It tells us that there's a serious attempt to reinterpret and reconceptualize the entire Euro-Atlantic security structure. By this, I do not mean the disbandment of NATO or any such thing, but even the Ukrainians themselves, Mikhailo Podolyak, who was one of Zelensky's closest advisors, just gave an interview to an independent Russian source in which he spoke about the necessity of negotiating the entire structure of European security. This is the first time that we have heard something like this from a very high level and very intelligent, by the way, Ukrainian politician. This really is an important shift. Now, the rest is in the details, and often things get stuck there. But the fact that the conceptual shift has happened, I think, is very important. Let's see.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Anton. We're going to change subjects right now and move to a developing story on the Korean Peninsula. Anton Fedyashin is leaving us, and we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We will be right back.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to the show. We turn now to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the concerns that the DPRK's leader may be about to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. Joining us is Jenny Town. She is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and director of its 38 North program. Jenny, great to have you with us. The DPRK conducted what's been described as a, quote, suspected missile test this week. Apparently it failed, but there is concern that Kim Jong-un is preparing to test an ICBM. How is this being viewed in South Korea?
Well, it's being viewed with great concern, of course, and I think there's a lot of questions here as to what comes next. The last two tests, it was reported that it also used ICBM components. I think the North Koreans have telegraphed pretty clearly that they plan to do a reconnaissance satellite launch soon. And the question is whether there will be an ICBM test after that. But certainly the more that North Korea advances its ICBM capabilities, the more this calls into question, the credibility of such things like the extended deterrence from the United States. And I think the South Koreans are also watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely as well, in addition to what's happening in North Korea. And it's painting a very worrisome picture, I think, in terms of South Korea's security in the future.
Victor Gar, what is the view from Beijing? If the North tests an ICBM, I mean, couldn't this ramp up tensions on the Korean Peninsula?
China is opposed to any new developments of the nuclear warheads or launch capacities, including ICBM launches, for example, because they have been declared in violation of the United Nations Security Council adopted resolutions. So China stands to protect the integrity of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. On the other hand, China urges all parties to really deal with the root causes of the tension on the Korean Peninsula and try to remove the fundamental concern that DPRK is faced with in terms of what it perceived as the threat to its security and survival. For example, the joint military exercises by the United Nations forces and ROK forces on the southern side of the Korean Peninsula. So I would say it is time for all parties involved to re-engage with each other, to talk about the whole range of issues in order to achieve lasting peace and to push for the signing of a peace treaty between the relevant parties on the Korean Peninsula. And this is the only right way to achieve a lasting solution of the tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
Michael O'Hanlon, there were some high-profile meetings between President Trump, former President Trump, and the North Korean leader when President Trump was president. And it looked, for a little while, it looked that there was some opportunity for dialogue. But President Biden doesn't seem to be interested in engaging with the North Koreans at all. Is that a mistake?
Well, first of all, President Biden has said that we will meet the North Koreans wherever they wish and whenever they wish to talk. And so I don't think he's giving them the cold shoulder, but I think you're still right that it's different from President Trump, and Trump was willing to talk directly with Kim Jong-un. Biden's not offering a summit with the North Korean leader. He's going to make sure there's some preparatory work done first. But I would like to see the Biden team be a little bit more ambitious and a little bit more creative. We're not going to see the North Koreans agree to give up their entire nuclear arsenal as part of an initial deal. The United States, I believe, has been unrealistic about that for 20 years. We're going to have to work more incrementally, or at least in maybe two steps. And I think the first step would be trying to verifiably dismantle North Korean production capability to make more nuclear weapons, and also agree to long-term bans on testing for nuclear weapons and ICBMs. That's their part. And then we, along with other UN members, lift many of the sanctions that were imposed in 2017. So you have a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for an end to nuclear production and testing. I think that's a pretty good deal. But unfortunately, as I see it, the United States has been too adamant in both Democratic and Republican administrations about insisting on complete North Korean nuclear disarmament. Nobody wanted North Korea to have the bomb, but now that they do, and now that they watch, that Saddam Hussein was overthrown because he didn't have the bomb, Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, he didn't have the bomb. The Ukrainians are being invaded by China or by Russia, they don't have the bomb, and maybe there's a correlation here. So maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that North Korea wants to hold on to at least some of its weapons. I think we have to be a little more pragmatic, and that's where I think the Biden team should be more imaginative.
Jenny Town, South Korea has elected a new leader. He'll be taking office in May. Will there be a different approach from the new leader in the relationship with the DPRK?
Absolutely. The conservative Yoon administration is going to go back to a more traditional approach. I think it will align well with what Biden administration has been doing so far. It's very denuclearization first before relations can improve, focused on sanctions implementation. I think you will see some initial coordination, trilateral coordination between Japan, the US, and South Korea on this issue, because I think this is the first time in a long time where they feel like they're more on the same page. That said, I don't think it will be very effective. I think in this current climate, especially in the shadow of Ukraine, as Michael said, this is a perfect time when the North Koreans are it's reinforcing views in North Korea of what happens to countries that don't have nuclear weapons against larger nuclear armed adversaries. And so if we really want North Korea to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons program, I think we have to make a much more compelling case as to why they should do that. And it really is going to have to require the U.S. to do more, and more than just on the economic sphere, but in terms of the security environment in general.
Victor Gar, the incoming president in South Korea, he wants to ramp up military exercises between the United States and South Korea. He even wants another additional THAAD system, that's the United States missile defense system. How is Beijing going to view that?
Well, personally, I wish the incoming new president of ROK all the good luck and success in his endeavors. On the other hand, I think while we look at some of the policy initiatives that he and his team have proposed, it could be viewed as very alarming, and it could be viewed as not being very constructive. Why? Because the last thing that the Korean Peninsula would need now is more fuel onto the fire, and more tensions, more escalations. Whatever that the new incoming leader is proposing probably will be viewed as very hostile by DPRK, and will only fuel more efforts on the part of DPRK to further go to the hilt in terms of the nuclear experiment as well as launch capacities. And this will again be viewed as very destructive by both and multiple sides. So this probably will be a dead end, a very dangerous course of action.
Okay, Michael O'Hanlon, very briefly, Jenny Tan was talking a moment there about the United States giving North Korea some kind of compelling reason to come to some kind of agreement. I mean, would that include something like ironclad security guarantees to North Korea, which might even have to be enshrined in some kind of a security agreement, a treaty of some kind?
Yeah, I'm not against a peace treaty. I don't think it should be declared with great fanfare and celebration until we've made more progress on the relationship writ large. But I think as a matter-of-fact statement that no one intends to attack anyone else, and that we could commit to this with written assurances, I think that could be part of a useful deal. So I've been a little bit more open-minded to that concept than a lot of my colleagues that I know throughout Washington and the American debate. So yes, and also I think that we can recognize we don't really need these big military exercises. We can actually be pretty effective with a lot of smaller exercises. We have to do those. But on the big exercises, I think we can be flexible.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks to you for joining us on another edition of The Heat. Have a great weekend.